Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on international approaches to climate change, planning and adaptation in the built and natural environments. This event is being brought to you by PICHTR and OIST Foundation. As a heads up, this virtual gathering is being recorded. And we're going to just wait a little bit for everybody to join before we really delve into the topic. But for those that are currently present in this webinar, Naoki, how many people do we already have on the webinar? I know about 250 people registered, so there's quite a bit of interest on this particular topic.
Yeah, right now we have 75 people live.
Wonderful. Yeah, welcome everybody. We're super happy that you are all here. We have a really great lineup of speakers today. I'm going to ask for the folks that have already joined us, if you can please introduce yourself. It's always so much fun to see who's joining us. So if you can put in the chat, where are you calling from? And also, how did you hear about this webinar? And then I'm going to turn it over to Naoki. If you could please tell us, some of these responses. And before I do, I almost forgot to introduce the full cast for today's production. So I am Veronica Rocha. I am co-emceeing this event on behalf of PICHTR with David James, who is my co-MC from the OIST Foundation, and Naoki Nagai, who is our DJ helping us with all technical matters. So, we're super happy to be here with you today. So back to you, Naoki. Where are people calling from and how do they hear about this event?
Yeah, so we have from Honolulu, from the PICHTR email list, and Honolulu. And a lot of people heard from the email list. I guess they joined the last webinar too.
Great.
Yeah, Eva Beach.
So what? Oh, wonderful. So it seems like all over Hawaii. Hopefully we also have some people joining us internationally. I know looking through the registration list, there was a lot of people that were registered, not only from New Zealand, but also from Japan and also domestically from the mainland. So next in the Q&A, I would love to get some feedback. What questions are you hoping will be answered by today's discussion? I will say that at any time, if you can please enter into the Q&A specifically so we can keep track of your questions. Any sort of question that you may have, we will have time at the end of this webinar. We're going to give it maybe 20 minutes, perhaps 30 minutes, depending on how presentations go, to answer your questions. But please, at any time, please enter into the Q&A, any question that pops into your mind related to today's webinar and subject at hand. So Naoki, any one or two questions that might have already come through the Q&A?
Not yet. So if you have questions, please put in the Q&A box, please.
Great. Okay. All right. So with that, I would like to formally get started. And first, I would like to thank our sponsors that are making today's event possible. That is Hawaiian Electric, as well as the Consulate General of Japan in Honolulu. We are so appreciative of your support. For today's discussion, we're going to go through some brief introductions on PICHTR as well as the OIST Foundation. And then we would like to provide a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the Great Japan Earthquake. We also have some sad news to share regarding Shimrit Perkel-Finkel, who participated in our webinar back in February, who unfortunately passed. So we would like to honor her as well. And then we're going to delve into the topic. I will be providing some background, presenting you to our panelists, and then we're going to be delving into 3 presentations. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dennis Teranishi, who is the president and CEO of PICHTR, to provide us some brief brief background on PICHTR's history and vision. Dennis.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. PICHTR was started through an idea of U.S. Senator Spark Matsunaga. He thought that Hawaii could be a great way to improve U.S.-Japan relations through research and technology. So he came up with this idea, and Governor Oriyoshi, who was governor at that time, started the foundation for PICHTR. And in 1983, the Hawaii legislature um, funded the program, and it was originally under the University of Hawaii. Then by 1985, we changed it into a nonprofit. So the vision of PICHTR is to become a leader in planning and deployment of place-based sustainable practices throughout Hawaii and the Asia Pacific. We received strong financial support from the Japanese government for our first 15 years. And this support continues with this event that the Consulate General of Japan in Honolulu is a sponsor. About 15 years ago, PICHTR developed Energy Accelerator, which was an accelerator to fund new technology companies to work on renewable energy solutions for Hawaii, because Hawaii had developed the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. So it was a very successful program. And we just spun it off about 2 years ago and formed a new nonprofit, because that organization has become a very strong standalone company now. So now PICHTR is looking for a new project to work on. So we're going to be focusing on a new challenge, which is climate change adaptation. So we will work on capacity building and advocacy to enable forward progress on the most critical climate adaptation initiatives, and create opportunities for a more resilient and economically strong Hawaii. So today's webinar is part of our capacity building efforts to increase awareness of climate change adaptation challenges and opportunities for Hawaii and hopefully the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce next David James, who heads the OIST Foundation. OIST is Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, a graduate research university in Okinawa. So David.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And I'd just like to say that we're extremely proud to partner with you and PICHTR on this webinar series. As Dennis mentioned, the OIST Foundation is a US-based 501c3 nonprofit that supports scientific breakthroughs, innovation, and the sustainable development of Okinawa through OIST. We're just a little over 1 year old as a nonprofit organization based in New York. And OIST, for those who don't know, is the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University. It's this year a 10-year-old institution based in Okinawa, founded by a group of Nobel Prize-winning scientists to create an innovation hub in Okinawa and be really at the forefront of science and technological research. And we hope everyone on this webinar will eventually come and visit us. So with that, I'd like to now turn our attention to an event that happened very tragically 10 years ago. 10 years ago at 2:46 p.m. Japan Standard Time on March 11th, a magnitude 9 earthquake occurred off the coast of Tohoku, Japan, with devastating impact. The event led to a massive tsunami, a nuclear power plant meltdown, and to many deaths. These tragic events caused much suffering that continues to this day. And we will soon pause for a moment of silence to commemorate these events. But before we do, I'd like to read you a poem that was written by a survivor shortly after the tragedy. Many of the survivors wrote poems that were published in newspapers. And on March 11th, just several days after the disaster, one person named Nobuko Kato in Iwate wrote, "If my wailing could return everything to what it once was, I'd weep until my eyes were swollen shut." This was a devastating event with repercussions that continue. Before we take a moment of silence, we also want to call your attention to Shimrit Perkel Finkel. As Veronica mentioned earlier, Shimrit was a panelist exactly 1 month ago at our previous webinar. She was an amazing leader. She had founded Eco Concrete and was a marine biologist who cared so deeply about the earth and about people. And tragically, in an accident earlier this week in Israel, we lost her. She passed away. So we want to express our condolences to her family and to her loved ones. So in remembrance of the 3/11 tragedy and in sympathy for Shimrit, we would now like to ask that everyone take a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and I'll now turn it over to Veronica.
Thank you, David, for those profound remarks. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So today's topic, international approaches to climate change, planning and adaptation in the built and natural environment. So wanted to provide some backdrop discussion before we delve into the three presentations. So last month, the Union of Concerned Scientists put forth a statement saying that stopping climate change is not enough. Not only do we need to focus on reducing greenhouse gases to stop climate change, but because of the amount of emissions already in the atmosphere and the fact that we are seeing the firsthand the impacts of climate change, we must also adapt to climate change. To give you a sense of magnitude of the problem, in the US alone in 2020, climate impacts amounted to $100 billion, which was a twofold increase from the prior year in 2019. So today's webinar is really intended to help communities take stock of the very good work that has already taken place in terms of helping with climate adaptation efforts, and then also to help communities mobilize towards, building upon these efforts and going beyond them. The importance of multi-hazard planning and adaptation is really highlighted by recent events in Hawaii. Over the last couple of days, Hawaii, throughout the state, we have experienced heavy rain that has caused flooding, landslides, fear of dam failure, evacuations, and has also destroyed or damaged homes. In fact, yesterday, Governor Ige declared a state of emergency. The picture on the left is a picture of a home in Haleiwa that has been flooded, and that's here in Oahu, where I live. And the picture of the right is in Hana Highway in Haiku, Maui. And this just happened, a couple of days ago. So I cannot stress enough the importance of today's topics. With that, I would like to now introduce to you our wonderful lineup of panelists, starting with Colton Chang, who is the Senior Vice President of Planning and Technology at Hawaiian Electric Company. He has the responsibility for planning Hawaiian Electric's 100% renewable energy grid and the procurement of cost-effective, reliable, and resilient renewable resources to fulfill its plans. Colton is also responsible for developing and managing Hawaiian Electric strategies and budgets for the transmission and distribution system. Next, I would like to introduce you to Derek Todd, who is a coastal geomorphologist at Jacobs. He has over 35 years of experience in investigating coastal processes and hazards and assessing the potential future changes in coastlines and river mouth stability. This experience includes time working in consultancy and local governments in universities in New Zealand as well as in Australia. Also joining Derek is Ian Weissman, who is an associate environmental scientist, also from Jacobs. His background is in physical geography. He has an experience in a wide range of environmental skills and issues, including water quality, management, impact assessment, flooding, and stormwater management. He is an experienced project manager focused on the delivery of environmental studies, including the Christchurch multi-hazard project, which we are going to be discussing today. Last but not least, we also have Tim Ravasi joining us all the way from Okinawa. He is a professor of marine sciences and the principal investigator of the Marine Climate Change Unit at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, also known as OIST. Tim is particularly interested in looking at ecology relevant issues in light of rapid environmental changes such as climate change. Using integrated approaches, he seeks to understand how coral reef fish respond to rapid environmental changes such as climate change, heat waves, overfishing, and urbanization. So we're going to be hearing about his research today. With that, I would love to turn it over to Colton to please share his screen and start his presentation. Thank you, Colton.
Okay, give me 1 second to get set up. Aloha and good afternoon, everyone. Okay, and Veronica, just a quick check that everyone is able to see my slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So again, aloha and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to PICHTR and OIST for the opportunity to share some of what we're doing here in Hawaii to plan our system, plan our electric system to be better prepared for the changes we're going to see in our future due to climate. Before I kind of dive into my presentation, knowing that there's going to be a lot of material we're covering today, I just want to share some initial thoughts, especially for those folks who may not come from Hawaii, may not be as familiar as the situation we have here in Hawaii, just to kind of set the stage. So some initial thoughts that I want to share, number one, climate change focus in Hawaii has been on our mitigation efforts. And one of the things that Hawaii has made for a name for itself, and something that I think we should all be proud of, is our leading efforts to reduce our carbon emissions through our renewable energy and greenhouse gas policies. But the other end of climate change, right, the other half of it, adaptation, that Veronica spoke to, responding to that climate change, including efforts to improve or enhance resilience, is really an emerging area of focus by all of the folks that we speak to in our utility, whether it's our customers, the communities that we serve, lawmakers, and our regulators, both at the local, county, the state, and even at the national level. And it's really the combination of the two that ultimately forms our approach and our response to climate change. You can't just do one, you really need to do both. The other thing to share some initial thoughts is, with efforts like electrification, which in part contributes to our mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but electrification, the greater reliance by all of us on technology, more recent things like a much larger amount of us working from home, and some of these emerging trends longer term will fundamentally raise the expectation on how our communities and our customers expect to be served by an electric system. They're going to want it to be more reliable, and they're going to want it to be more resilient than they are today. And I think that's an important reminder for all of us. And lastly, right, accounting for and planning our system, whatever that system might be, right? When you're planning for climate change, it really should be done within the broader context of what we call integrated planning for the grid. We can't develop plans and take actions on climate change and enhancing our resilience only from that perspective. We have to do it in conjunction with a whole bunch of other things that are driving change in our infrastructure. And I think the same applies to all infrastructure owners. Because we do have a lot of participants that are not from Hawaii, and thank you all for putting that into the chat of where you're from. I like to talk about what we do here in Hawaii from the context of this slide. We all have Google Earth. We all have seen the globe. We almost never ever look at the globe with Hawaii in the middle. And so when you do look at the globe with Hawaii in the middle, it really illustrates the geographic isolation and by extension, the exposure and vulnerability that Hawaii faces in the wake of a range of things, including the changes into the climate and how it'll affect us. The electric system in Hawaii is a little bit different, and Hawaiian Electric, we serve 5 out of the 6 islands in the state of Hawaii. We have in slide here, it shows the number of customers that we have on each of our counties that we serve. But one of the things that I just want to note here, just so that everyone understands the current situation here in Hawaii, is that our electric grids here in Hawaii, unlike virtually every other state in the US and even other island systems, our electric systems are not interconnected to each other. So every single one of the 5 islands that we serve, plus the island of Kauai that's served by a different utility, there are no electrical connections between them. So each grid is standalone. We're not able to lean on each other during day-to-day events. And our ability to lean on each other during emergency events is more on the people and equipment and materials side. We are not able to lean on each other electrically because of that electrical isolation. And that creates some new challenges for us. When we talk about threat scenarios and we talk about climate change, we kind of do it in 2 pieces. At least that's the way we kind of think about it. We first need to understand, before you begin thinking about the effects of climate change and how that will affect threats, we need to understand what are the threats that we face today. And one of the things that we learned early on is that as an electric utility, although we serve everyone in the 3 counties that we serve, our perspective is still somewhat narrow and incomplete when it comes to threats, right? And so we recognize that we need to begin talking with others, with first responders, with government officials, with other infrastructure owners, as well as our large and small customers, to really understand from their perspective, what are the threat scenarios that are most important? There are so many to consider, and there's no way that any entity has the bandwidth or the budget to take them all on. So we need to figure out which are the ones that are a priority for us. And this graphic just shows an example of what we got in feedback from stakeholders on threat scenarios. And not all of them, as you'll see in here, are threats that are made by nature, right? Some of it's created by man, but you need to look at it in totality to figure out how to set a right foundation for looking at the impacts of climate change and how that's going to affect our threats. So with those threat scenarios as a base with some level of priority for today, we then need to layer on top of that how sea level rise and other impacts, longer term impacts that climate change will introduce, to see how that affects the priority, the magnitude, and ultimately the risks associated with different threats. As shown in here, we're working with various government agencies to understand what they are doing in their adaptation plans so we can be better informed as we develop ours. But we quickly recognize that in order to make good decisions of how we should prioritize our response to what we see as the growing risk from climate change, on our ability to reliably serve our customers, we needed more quantitative data and more sophisticated tools to help us prioritize that work well. So there are 2 efforts that we focused on in terms of tools. Number 1, we wanted to find a climate tool that could give us area-specific or location-specific impacts of various climate threats or various threats, and understand how those threats will change over time based on different climate scenarios. And that's the Jupyter Int'l climate science forecasting model that's shown on the left. In addition to that, we also identified the need to have what we call a damage prediction model. It's not enough to understand where your greatest threats are. To really be in an informed place to make decisions on how you prioritize your investments and actions that you should take, we need to understand that when you have these different threats, when they manifest themselves in terms of high winds, a flood, a hurricane, whatever it might be, that a climate forecasting model will deliver to you, you also want to understand what is the potential impact of that threat in terms of outages to customers, in terms of the cost to restore and rebuild infrastructure to do that. So with these two pieces, we're in a better position to make those kinds of determinations. And not, so that's more the quantitative way to understand how to prioritize a response. We cannot let go and cannot ignore the other side, right? Which is the engagement with our various communities. The slide shows a few examples here where in parallel with developing quantitative tools, we need to continue to have discussions with the customers, with other infrastructure owners, with communities that we serve, to really understand their priorities, where they're coming from, what's important to them, and not necessarily just make assumptions of what that might be. And then ultimately, we bring this all together. Like I said in my initial thoughts, I don't recommend that resilience and climate change adaptation planning be done within, sort of a silo of addressing that individually. Here in Hawaii, as many of you folks attending know, we need to really transform our electric grid to be ready and able to reliably and cost effectively interconnect, integrate, and utilize renewable resources up to the 100% goal that we've all established for ourselves. And that's going to trigger a complete transformation of the electric system. And with that going on, we cannot plan for resilience in isolation. We really want to do them together. Not only does that give you a better solution, I think it allows us to get to that successful endpoint in a much more coordinated, much more cost-effective way. And ultimately, the inputs with data, the inputs from our stakeholders, plus the coordination of our resilience work with our other planning efforts, how we need to transform our grid, ultimately will give us the best information that we can develop to make important priority decisions, including ultimately here on the right, budget decisions. But I do want to sort of make one note, right? This diagram is intended to share how we're thinking about it at Hawaiian Electric. We would be blind to or remiss in if we were to do this just in isolation. Even if we get input from stakeholders along the process as shown on the left, we need to make sure that ultimately what we decide to do is coordinated with other infrastructure owners. It's coordinated with local governments, because we ultimately need to coordinate our work together in order to be successful. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end. I thought it'd be useful to share very briefly our Jupyter Int'l tool. This is a static screenshot. It's not actually the tool itself. But this tool here, just this screen capture here, just as an image, in this case, of a probabilistic flooding portrayal for the airport Pearl Harbor area. It's a little zoomed out, but gives you an indication of what it looks like for a big region. We actually have these models for all 5 islands that we serve. And you're able to take this model, zoom in as much as you can into a local area. So like in this case, I've zoomed in into the Honolulu Harbor, Makiki, and portions of downtown Honolulu. If you look on the left, the great thing about a Jupyter Int'l tool is that it's a dynamic model. We can plug in there different climate scenarios. We can plug in different hazard types. We can look at different sea level rise assumptions. And then we can display data in various forms, right? We can show depth of flooding, like what this slide happens to show. And then we can show things like the level of probability associated with them. So we can change that to understand what that means. At the end of the day, these maps, like what's shown here, are incredibly helpful to us in planning our resilience work, because now we have a more informed basis to say, well, I think we should prioritize some work to raise our transformers or make add watertight doors to our substations in the Ala Moana area versus Nimitz Highway, even though perhaps the elevation in Nimitz Highway may be lower than in certain parts of Ala Moana. And this kind of granular local data really helps us figure out what we should be doing first, what should we be doing next, and ultimately that full priority of work to do. This is an example for flooding. We have a similar model within the Jupyter platform to look at wind. So you can see in here by color, using Maui County as an example, the different wind speeds that we predict on a 1% basis. And you can see those individual blocks, that pixelation that assigns the probability, the 1% probability of certain wind speeds. So we can identify which, for example, transmission structures on Maui we want to design, say for 120 mile per winds in the near term, and then maybe design other structures in other locations for 80 miles per hour, because the probability of having higher winds are lower, and that allows us to kind of right size our solution.
Colton, I know this is your last slide. I'm going to ask you to. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Veronica. So just real quickly, final thoughts. I think a question we can all ask each other: how do we further leverage the climate and modeling and simulation tools? For us at Hawaiian Electric, one of the big things we're trying to solve for, figure out for the future, is how does climate change affect the production, the availability, and the usefulness of wind and solar renewable energy into the future? We're making big investments there. I want to understand what that'll be. We're all in the same canoe here in Hawaii, right? And there needs to be this broad connection across all infrastructure owners and with government on hardening resilience, and especially on things like managed metering. If we're not coordinated there, we won't be very efficient in our work. And there's a really important role for policy to avoid making the threat and the adaptation challenge bigger. So as we're doing new projects, as we're building new communities, let's make sure when we're designing them, making decisions on them, that they are built from the very beginning for a very different climate that we're going to see 50 plus years from now. And then last but not least, I think we can all agree that climate change is a marathon. It's not a sprint, but the marathon needs to start now. So thank you, Veronica. Back to you.
Thank you, Colton. Really appreciate this excellent presentation. I'd like to turn it over now to Derek Todd. If you can please share your screen and walk us through your presentation.
Okay, kia ora from Christchurch, New Zealand. We're just bringing it up. So is that should be there now, is it?
Yes, you are set.
Cool. Okay, so I'm Derek, and with me I have Ian Wiseman, who's going to talk about the last two bits. We're going to talk about the Christchurch multi-hazards climate change adaptation study that we've been working on for a few years now. There we go. So Christchurch, for those of you that don't know, is a city of 400,000 people on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. This study we started in 2017 with the prioritisation and mapping of multi-hazards, a number of hazards that we were interested in. This is about flood primarily. So we then have moved into modelling of the changing baseline flood risk with climate change, and particularly with sea level rise. And that's in progress, should be finished in the next 6 months or so. Then moving on to developing and assessing different pathways towards developing an adaptive flood management plan. But to help with that, we engaged in an early decision-making exercise with the decision makers within the city, because this is for the local council, to get them to understand the process and the consequences. So it is, as we said, a flood management. The aim is adaptive flood management plans over a long period of time to adapt to climate change. But the difference is that we've looked at multi-hazard shock events within that. And so we started with 15 different hazard sources, which we came down to 4, which are of key influence in exacerbating the flood risk that we occur in Christchurch, and flooding is our primary hazard for the city. A couple of those are around the slow creep hazards due to climate change, so coastal erosion, inundation with sea level rise, rising groundwater. In terms of dealing with those, there is coincidence with existing coastal storms, so high storm surge and waves combined with high intensity, long duration rainfall. So what is that doing to the flood risk? But then we've got some shocks. Now we experienced our own earthquake, devastating earthquake sequence in 2010, 2011. So those things affected the flooding and the risk within the city. And we're also prone to far field and regional tsunamis, being on the east coast of the Pacific. So what we wanted to understand is how much might they influence the flood risk within the city going forward. So in the context of earthquakes and tsunamis, it is probably similar in some ways to many Hawaiian or Japanese cities. So Christchurch as a study area, it's for those of you that probably haven't been here, it's a very flat, low-lying topography. It's built on former swamp deposits. There are 4 major river catchments in or near the city. It has some coastal estuaries, and it has a very low shoreline of sand dune shoreline. Our earthquake sequence in 2010, 2011, our most devastating earthquake was centered just here, right on the edge of the city. While it might not have been large at 6.3 magnitude, it resulted in 185 deaths within the city. More importantly, it really changed the landscape. 3,000 buildings in the CBD were destroyed or had to be destroyed. 10,000 homes in the suburbs, mainly on the eastern part of the city, were demolished due to liquefaction and land failure. And as a result, these red areas on the maps and around here have been red zoned, where it has been decided unfeasible, or it was at that stage over the last 10 years, to redevelop those. But importantly, in terms of flooding, the earthquake exacerbated that flood risk by that land subsidence and liquefaction, but particularly the land subsidence, by up to 0.5 metre in places along the eastern seaboard. So it was like we had an instant sea level rise. And that really did change the level of flood risk, and gave the city needed then to investigate and manage that flood risk, but at the same time wanted to look at what other hazards might have an effect on that flood risk, and particularly to answer that question around, is it worth protecting the city from flooding if another hazard will significantly increase that risk or make the damage worse? So that's the basis of our project. The first part of our project involved looking at the spatial coexistence of hazards. So around the outside, we have a number of single hazards that have been mapped. So we have tsunami hazard, we have the flood hazard, then we have a liquefaction hazard, land subsidence hazard of what has occurred, and rising groundwater hazards. And so what we've done in the multi-hazard lens is put all those together to have a spatial coexistence of hazards, with the darker red being where more hazards, that land being susceptible to more hazards. Within that study area, which is around 1,300 hectares, the profile within different parts of it is reasonably similar. Most of the areas being exposed to 2 to 3 hazards, but except for the red zone, that residential red zone from the earthquake, most of that is exposed to 4 to 5 hazards. But when we look at it collectively over the whole of that area, we have actually around 3,000 hectares within that eastern side of the city that are susceptible to 4 or more multi-hazards. So that raised a question for the city, as we said, is, do we protect against flooding? If we do, how do we do it? And for how long might we do it, given this changing baseline of sea level rise and climate change? We also looked at the temporal coincidence. So which hazards could occur together? This is our full list of 15 different hazards or different sources. Coastal storms already cause issues. The same weather systems can cause coastal storm events for us, as well as produce rainfall. Now, they may not be tropical cyclone or hurricane intensity, but on a local scale, they really do change the flood risk. And then obviously the coincidence in the future with coastal erosion, coastal inundation, and high groundwater levels. So we needed in our modelling to incorporate all of those things into our scenarios to look forward to give us the adaptation answers. We were very particularly, or the city was very particularly interested in cascades, having experienced the earthquake cascade, where it changed really the morphology of the land, and we recognising that the future climate change will do the same. So what we were interested in is, was there other hazards that will change the geomorphology and land levels around the city that will therefore increase the risk? And we were particularly interested in tsunamis, and we felt particularly distant tsunamis for us. South America is the major source of those. That could change the geomorphic conditions around the Christchurch estuary, which would lead to a long and greater flood risk. What we found with additional work was that wasn't actually the case. Our maximum tsunami waves from that event are around 10 to 15 metres, and the geomorphic change may only last for around a decade. And so from a long-term perspective, in terms of our modelling, tsunami wasn't included in the modelling, but certainly will be included in the consideration of adaptation. So this is our schedule of the changing baseline of flood risk. To see what can we move forward to get the baseline to then understand how the different adaptations might perform. So we have climate change adaptation, both in terms of sea level rise, but also the change in the fluvial characteristics of the rain events. So what will they do over different time slices? What will the groundwater do? So it will increase. So each of these needed an input into the scenarios. And the same with coastal erosion will increase over time. So does that exacerbate flooding by reducing the ability of our sand dune systems to prevent coastal inundation or the changes around inside the estuary? Importantly for adaptation is to include development changes. So the city will grow and is forecast to grow, so this goes through time. So our risk also increases with that increase in development. Within this, we managed to put in a couple of earthquake shocks at the same level as what we've currently got to understand what that would do to any defence systems or mitigations we might do. Just very quickly, an overview of adaptation. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, that without actions, the risk would be increased beyond what's tolerable. The adaptation seeks to maintain a tolerable level of risk by a number of small actions rather than something large and capitally expensive up front. There is a high degree of uncertainty in the future, and therefore we need a fair degree of flexibility in how we might deal with that, and that some of our actions might be short-term, like the yellow one here, where others might be long-term and we need to change path. We need to understand what our community's tolerance to risk is. And we need to make that measurable, and we need to make it transparent so that they can make decisions, informed decisions around their long-term or short-term futures. We needed to look at different combinations of actions because there's different parts of flooding. There's coastal flooding, fluvial flooding, which all have different mitigation measures. And we needed to understand that other decisions around environmental, economics, and social benefits will change over time that go into that decision. So what we wanted to do was work with our decision makers to get them well aware of how those things might come in early. And so we developed an exercise which Ian is going to talk about.
Excellent. Thanks, Derek. So we developed this exercise with decision makers where we got a workshop together and we gave them basically a game scenario where they can actually choose to implement actions over time to address flood risk. So this is part of the board that was developed. Across the top, you'll see time slices of sea level rise. And down the side are various options of things we can do. We were covering policy options, things like retreat, and infrastructure options like stop banks, for instance. And what you could do is actually choose when to put an option in, and you got immediate feedback on what it did in terms of protecting against flooding and also what it might cost to actually do that. And you can quickly just run different scenarios through this tool to actually see how you can manage flood risk. And options are like this. This is one for tidal control. You get information here based on existing modeling information about what the flood risk might be and what benefits you get, and some high level what the cost might be of doing that option. We could put that together. So that bit of the board is on the bottom of the screen. And then we had a lot of metrics around it to give the people in the workshop feedback on those options and how they put them together. So across the top, those time slices of sea level rise, some indication of the key metrics around flood damage. So that's basically our key things protecting floors. So how are we actually doing with that? The options you can switch on at any point in time and decide whether it's better to switch them on earlier, for instance, as in, is it better to build stop banks early or build them late? You had a quick feedback of whether we were actually meeting our objectives of managing flooding. And we had some residual risks, so what flood damage is left. And then some key metrics as well around the overall cost of the scheme and also the amount of floor levels protected, the cost per property, plus one factor on multi-criteria, which picked up an overview of other factors like environmental consenting risk and a whole pile of other things built into that, just whether there's other issues in there. Now, this is really interesting with the workshop environment because we ended up with a group of various subject area decision makers from our client organization coming together, workshopping things. And start off with they quite quickly put a few scenarios in, and then they started to think much more about the things like the MCA and the other things they need to know about in decision making to choose between the options and to choose when to put them in. And questions like, if we end up with thinking of retreat, when should we actually do that? When's the best time to move into it? So it just allowed them to think through what the decision-making process might end up looking like for them once they get to the point of actually having to go to the community and work through adaptive planning and actually come up with an adaptive plan to manage flood risk over the next 100 years. This gives them an idea of how they can do it. Let's say we developed this on the early information. It's the best we had at the moment. We'll update this again to use within the project once our baseline modeling is done. But it gave us a nice idea of how we deal with adaptation as technical people, bringing in the technical information. And then on the flip side of that, what things the decision makers need to know to actually make a decision at any point in time. So with that wraps up what we wanted to talk about in this brief kind of overview here of this adaptation planning and dealing with coastal flooding, sea level rise driven flooding within this multi-hazard environment. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Derek, for an excellent presentation. I will say I was in Christchurch years after the earthquake, and I was there for some aftershocks, and was able to experience firsthand not only the devastation of the earthquake, but also the resilience of the Christchurch community. And I'm so happy to see that they've engaged this excellent team of experts to help them, with their resilience planning and adaptation. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Tim Ravasi to please share his screen and begin his presentation.
Okay, good morning and hello everyone. Can you see my screen now? So
Yes,
I would like to thank Veronica and
Tim.
Yep.
Apologies, Tim. You're not in full slideshow. We're seeing basically your present now. That's good. Thank you.
It's good.
Oh, you're back
okay.
to.
No, I think.
Okay, now you're good.
All right. Sorry about that. So thank you, Veronica. Thank you, PICHTR and the OIST Foundation, David, and of course, OIST. And good morning, aloha from Okinawa. So today, I would like to share with you some of our research, which is basically implicate the question is how resilient or how coral reef ecosystem, in particular fish, they may adapt to climate stressor. And I know that you all very familiar with the concept of climate change, but I want to make a couple of points here. These are predictions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about the temperature on the left side and the acidification or pH on the right side of our ocean in the future, in 100 years from now. So the point is, we already saw this graph, right? And so the bottom line is, if the carbon dioxide emission is keeping the same rate, by the end of the century, we will have warmer ocean, roughly 3 degrees Celsius warmer and more acidic. And that is called ocean warming and acidification. But the point I want to make is that we are here where now we say current day, meaning if you want to study the impact of climate stressor on coral reef ecosystem, we have to actually generate or mimic the future in laboratory, because right now we don't really measure the climate change as is per this prediction. Another point I want to make that the present actually, more important than this prediction is the increasing of the severity, duration, and frequency of marine heat wave. And this is a really actual problem. And that's what we put a lot of effort to study on. Unfortunately, these are stressors that's a prediction, but also stressors that's caused by us. But there is other more imminent problem that's society is pushing this coral reef system. For example, we have overfishing here in Okinawa. Overfishing, agriculture, urbanization, or coastal development is a very big problem. On top of that, we also have natural disturbances such tropical storm or possible earthquake, tsunami, and so forth. And all these disturbances, they add on to the classical concept of climate change. So we have to take in account. So in particular, this is very bad news for coral reef system. Why? Because coral reef ecosystem, you can see here, the blue line, they occur in an environment that is already extreme, meaning that around the equator, the water is already hot, and these systems are adapted to already what we call extreme environment. And so we think that if climate change will happen, or these disturbances have an impact of coral reef ecosystem, I think that these are the systems that will be impacted the most. So that's the reason why we need to pay more attention. So why we do this in my unit or here at OIST, not only because we, of course, want to preserve the beautiful ecosystem and our planet, but also because there is a lot of social and economical implication. For example, in Japan, fishery, it produces around $14 billion a year commercial fishery industry. So it's a big economy, part of the economy. Of course, if we deplete all the population of fish or commercial important fish, it is a series of consequences, not only on the ecosystem. And again, in Okinawa, other part of the world, like Hawaii, for example, or in Australia, Coral reef also bring a lot of income due to the tourists. People want to go and dive in and snorkeling in the reef. For example, here on the bottom, this is a figure from the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So Australia make around $5 to $6 billion a year in tourism economy for people visiting the Great Barrier Reef. And the same figure are actually true here in Okinawa. So there is not only the fact that we want to save the ecosystem, but also there is some economical implication. So how here at OIS we study the future and asking the question how coral reef fish, for example, they will adapt or they're resilient to climate stress. So we do in two ways: by recreating the future in the lab, and that's what we're talking about today, but also exploring natural analogs of future climate. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to discuss the point number 2. So how we do that? So basically, we go to the coral reef, we collect pair of breeding pair of fish. We're working a lot with clownfish, for example, Nemo, and we take it back to the lab. And in sophisticated aquaria, show you a picture later on, and we start to play with the condition. For example, increasing temperature, decreasing pH. Of course, taking into account the prediction, right? Increasing maximum 3 degrees Celsius, for example, and so forth. And then we measure a series of metabolic trait or phenotypic trait to the fish in laboratory. And we also use an integrative approach where we add very sophisticated genomic and molecular biology technique to study how the genomes of these fish change due to the climate stress. And we do that across generation. Why across generation of fish? Because if those predictions are real, so we don't wake up tomorrow where the ocean are plus 3 degrees. So the fish population that we could go through several generations before reaching the end point or the end of the century. So let me show, okay, these are the aquaria that we use. We are lucky enough to, here at OIST Marine Science Station on the top right, to have what we call the heat wave simulator, which is a very sophisticated aquaria that allows us to simulate the future, and including heat wave. And here on the bottom, these are 3 species of fish that normally we use as a model system to study this problem. We also have other type of fish, but today is based on these 3 species. Okay, so let me show you two. This I think is pretty cool result. In an experiment started by Jenny Donaldson at James Cook University in Australia 10 years ago, and my team. So we're using those sophisticated aquaria, we start to a breeding experiment where we can see the F0. So basically, these are the fish that we collect from the coral reef. We bring in aquaria and we put a current day temperature, normal temperature, plus 1.5 degree mid-century, or plus 3 degree end of the century prediction. And we let develop this fish and breed them. Okay, so then the baby fish, and that is the F2, we again split them in the same way. So current day control plus 1.5 plus 3 degree. What I want to point out here, you can see what we call the developmental fish are those fish that the parents, they never experience the new environment, but they grow and they develop throughout the entire life, which is 1 year, in higher temperature. The transgenerational on the right side are those fish which are born from parents that already experienced the climate change scenario. So the parents already have or developed the entire life in higher temperature. And we did this experiment, which took up to 7 years. And then we measure some metabolic performance of the fish. So I don't go in detail about the aerobiscope, but to cut a long story short, here what we measure is the energy that the fish need to spend to eat and digest, and the energy that the fish have left to grow and reproduce. So, of course, if you increase the water temperature, the fish need to spend more energy to eat, breathe, and digest, and it has less energy to grow and develop. You can see here now the blue color is the current day temperature, the green is plus 1.5, and the red is plus 3 degrees. You can see that if there is no acclimation, so the fish, if you take a fish, you throw in hot water, the aerobic scope or the metabolic performance is going down. And that is obvious, and we already knew that. So what happened to the developmental fish? Those fish that soon they hatch, we throw them in hot water and we let it develop in hot water. Again, same thing, both plus 1.5 or 3 degrees Celsius, the metabolic performance decreases. Now, that is the cool part. What happened to those fish, which parents, they already experienced 1.5 or plus 3 degrees Celsius? Check this out. So basically, they compensate the scope. So basically, these fish, they're already born adapted to this climate stress. So meaning something happened during the life of the parents, and the parents learn in the new environment and tell to the next generation, to the kids, they say, listen, you know, there is a new environment. Now you have to change something in your metabolic performance in order to survive it. And that is called fast transgenerational acclimation to climate change. So as I told you, we use an integrative approach, not only metabolic measurement or inbreeding or this kind of very elegant breeding system, but we also ask the question, so how these fish are acclimated or adapted? So what change in the genetic, on the gene or the genomic of this fish in order to be able to survive better or compensate their aerobic scope? And to do that, we use a genomic approach like genome sequencing or transcriptome sequencing, and also epigenetic approach. And this is a schematic show that we normally look in the liver of this fish because it's a metabolic behavior. So what we found after a few years is that if you look on the left side, here is a map that shows genes that are of the fish that are differentially expressed. And if you see the darker red dot, so these are genes that tend to be more expressed or activated only in those fish that transgenerational fish are adapted to the new condition. So this is a set of genes that, if you like, is a genetic program that need to be switched on and in order to compensate the higher temperature. And you can see the D developmental, they don't have those genes upregulated. So now if you ask the question, what this gene do, why they're able to adapt the fish? Well, are genes that are involved in heat stress, metabolism, and transport and so forth. So all genes that, as we said, they make sense to be upregulated if you want to survive in a warmer water. So there is an interesting question we ask during this exercise, how the parent transfer the information. So how the parent tell the kids, so listen, you have to modify this program in order to survive better. So then we ask help to a concept that is called epigenetic, which is basically a modification of the genome without changing the genetic code. It's not a mutation as Darwin teaches us. It's called epigenetic, it's above the genetic. And here, to cut a long story short, if you look on the yellow dot where there is the red cycle, these are the epigenome, so the epigenetic status of the genome of the fish that are adapted, the transgenerational fish. And you can see they're very similar to each other, but very different to the control on the left side. And here you can see here is the same data showing a different heat map. You can see here the transgeneration. You can see the right figure like as a barcode of the epigenetic of this fish across the entire genome. And you can see that on the left side where there is the red box, the transgenerational fish, they have this genetic or epigenetic barcode that is totally different than the developmental and the control. So what it does mean, meaning that the parent, something during the lifespan of the parent, change the genome and the epigenome of the next generation. And that is how the parents are able to transfer the information of the new environment. So, and again, if you look which are these, if you like, how physiologically do that, all these changing that occur only in transgenerational fish are involved in pathway or part of the organism that's basically as dealing with vasodilatation, regulation of blood flow, and so forth. So what does it mean? These are all pathway physiology that increase the intake of oxygen for the fish and are able to compensate the decrease of oxygen in in the water with higher temperature. So they compensate by increasing oxygen intake, for example, and energy metabolism, of course. So To conclude this part, what we show in the past 10 years, and this is true also for other type of fish that I don't have time to present here, fish are able to acclimate to higher water temperature just in one generation. This acclimation is possible thanks to metabolic compensation across multiple generations, and parent transfer the information of the new environment to the next generation by selective DNA methylation of specific site of the genome. Okay, you can say, well, this is a good news because even if climate change happen, fish, they will survive. We have to take it for granted this because we only look some traits here. We don't know, first of all, we know that it's different for different species of fish. And we also know that maybe there is other phenotypic trait that we are missing during our experiment. So don't take it as a positive news, but it's not totally a good news. So now I want to introduce the last few minutes a project that we started here in Okinawa, again, to study the resilience of coral reef ecosystem, a project that we just started with my colleague Norisato here in OIST. So related to coastal development. And that, I think, is a project and data that we are generated that can be introduced in the modeling that my colleague earlier explained in Christchurch, for example. So in December 2020, here in Onna Point, which is a village where OIST is, they started the construction of the four-season resort hotel. Okinawa the economy of Okinawa is based on tourism, and there is a lot of coastal development, building big resort literally on the coral reef. And we think this can have an impact of the coral reef because are fringing coral reef, so very close to the shore. And these are very massive effort of construction. And this site in particular is very close to us, very accessible, and we can sample it every month. And this is a long-term project, 2 to 3 years long project. So I'll show you, we don't have yet data because we just started, but I'll show you what we're trying to do. And also we try to transfer this project to the region of the Tohoku that David was mentioned before, and try to see if we can adopt this integrative project to study the recovery after the tsunami. But here is the site on the right side is the Okinawa, and here is Onna Son, the village, and where OIST is. And here is the aerial view of the site. The red map is where the hotel is being constructed right now. And here are our sampling site. On the left side, you can see also there is a lot of farming, which is also directly on the shore, which is not also very good for the runoff of, for example, nitrate and so forth. So here is an aerial view of this. Yeah, I'm done.
Tim, sorry, Veronica. So, I'm just going to ask you to wrap up, but yes, you can finish this.
Yeah, so this is the area view of the site. You can see the construction on the back, and here us sampling the water. So during this exercise and during this system, so what we are doing is monthly seawater sampling for eDNA analysis, environmental DNA analysis, in order to study the fish, coral, and dinoflagellate community. Scuba transit to assess every 3 months the state of the coral reef, and also area video survey using drone in order to study how the fringe reef changing. And we computationally integrated all these 3 pieces of information to predict how hotel construction or coastal development can impact coral reef. So thank you so much, and I'm finished. Thank you.
Tim, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Stop sharing.
I actually have, we're entering now into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I would like to encourage all participants to please enter your questions into the Q&A. And we're going to try to get to as many of the questions as possible. The first question that I have is actually for Tim. And I think it's fascinating that fish are essentially able to transfer evolutionary information to their offspring to deal with climate change and to adapt. My question is this specific to fish, or have you seen it in other species, whether they are marine or not?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So this is not specific to fish. Actually, the first example was in human during the maybe the people have old like me here, they remember the Dutch kids in Europe after the Nazis, of this small Dutch village where the Nazi was starving the population, and they survived. But the kids born from the parents that were starving, almost starving to death by the Nazis, they're born with completely different physiology, very skinny, very short compared to the average size. So, and then people did study on these Dutch kids, and they showed that the same mechanism we show of how fish they adapt to climate change was exactly the same. How the Dutch kids, they survived with low food, a low protein intake because of the starvation. So, and there is other example in other animal, invertebrate, and other type of fish, but also terrestrial. So, seem to be a common mechanism. This epigenetic that nature used to basically adapt fast to a changing condition, a changing environment.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, that's a bit encouraging. My next question is for Colton, and I will ask all of the panelists and presenters if you can please turn on your cameras. While you're not speaking, please stay on mute otherwise. So Colton, my question for you is, do you anticipate that the electric utility infrastructure resilience analyses that Hawaiian Electric has conducted will translate into future specific renewable energy procurement requirements? And if so, can you please provide a few examples of such requirements?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Veronica. So short answer, yes. It's actually happening already today. So in our most recent procurements for renewable energy, we've established a set of requirements in terms of location and physical or structural strength in the design of these facilities. I think that's a sort of a low-hanging fruit step. But I think in the future, the kinds of things we will also need to take on are, establishing perhaps preferred locations, not just where perhaps to stay away from low-lying areas, coastal areas, but what areas are actually preferred from a resilience standpoint, both from a vulnerability perspective, but also from a diversity perspective, right? Diversity gives in you inherently more resilience. That translates to even the technologies that you use, right? So I think there are a lot of opportunities going into the future, culling the data that we're getting from our analyses and our modeling to better inform our work going forward. We're just getting started.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the heads up on that. Okay, my next question is actually going to be for Derek and Ian, and it's related to the modeling that you presented. So I'm trying to understand, what is unique about the modeling and or the analysis that Jacobs did for Christchurch, and how is this modeling and our analysis applicable to other jurisdictions?
Good question. The uniqueness is the inclusion of the shocks in the future modeling. A lot of modeling going in the future includes climate change, but it doesn't then try to couple them all up. So in our case, what we've looked at is what are the coincidence of different sorts of hazards, and should that be included in the probabilities? And then what happens when you put a shock in our case, it's an earthquake, but it could just as easily be applied to tsunami, hurricane, volcano, any particular one-off event. And what does that then do? The important part of it is not so much the baseline modeling, it's what does that do then around your adaptation? So is your adaptation still going to be successful when you have those shocks that it'll occur in your geography? Or not, or what are the consequences? Is there, and it's the part that we're getting to yet, is there benefits in adapting a certain, for us, a defense against flooding? Do we get good benefits from tsunami, for example, as well, and from coastal events? Or do we get disadvantages that they actually make those other hazards worse? So the real difference is the way that we've included in, or tried to bring in, and looking to bring in those shock events, which will occur on this background of changing baseline.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Derek. Okay, I'd like to turn it over to David. David, I know there's several questions from the audience, and audience, please continue to input your questions into the Q&A or the chat, whichever you're most comfortable with. So David.
Thanks so much, Veronica. Yes, we have many questions. And the first one I'm going to address to Colton. This is a question that came in a few moments ago. You mentioned, Colton, solar and wind as alternatives, but any thoughts about biomass to energy, such as being done in Kauai?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I mentioned solar and wind as merely as examples of how renewable energy technologies are sort of forecasted today based upon either current or historical availability and variability. The point that I was trying to make is that climate change will ultimately affect that resource. It'll affect the predictability and the variability of solar. It'll affect the predictability and variability of wind. And to Ken's question, it'll actually affect biomass as well, right? Because if the trees or some sort of vegetation is the feedstock, their growth, their productivity per acre is going to be also affected by climate. And so being able to understand how that resource availability will change because of climate was really the point that I was trying to make, not to say that we're limiting ourselves just to solar and wind.
Thanks so much, Colton. And since I have you on, or sort of focused on you for the moment, let me follow up with another question that was asked. And the question says, are you looking at long-term adaptive planning frameworks for your infrastructure systems, like the framework Todd and Ian showed for Christchurch? Have you identified trigger points at which you may need to change some aspects of your systems in the future?
So I expect a phone call from Derek and Todd probably after this workshop. It was a great presentation that they gave, right? I really liked the very sort of structured and systematic approach that they talked about. I think we could benefit from having an adaptive planning framework like that. We just need to figure out for the longer term, how do we fit that within all the other things that we're looking to adapt and change within our system for reasons beyond just climate change and resilience. In terms of trigger points, my first reaction was, in 2013, when we had 13 named hurricanes enter the Central Pacific area, fortunately, none of them hit us as a hurricane. Probably was a triggering point for us, right? And I think now we see an urgency to really catch up, right, to the threats that we have today, much less to the growing threats we're going to see in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Let me turn to Derek and Ian for a moment. There's a question here that says, in the Christchurch study, how were the adaptation strategies used in the decision exercise identified? Besides cost and risk, is there a metric of feasibility or community acceptability of strategies in the game?
Let Ian answer that. It's more his.
Yeah, so to date, we don't have that community input in there. It's going to be something that's brought in later in the project. At the moment, it's very much considering technical feasibility of options, and we within our MCA we do have a number of other metrics in there that actually picks up on consentability, environmental issues, and also picks up on an idea of what the community might think about it. But it's not been reality checked. It's very much a project team driven, first pass through, just to give us an idea. And it was mostly used to prompt the discussions with the people involved in the exercise to get them thinking about it and thinking about the sort of information they actually might want to know around all those other values. Because that whole decision-making process is driven by a huge number of different values, and we as technical people can only input on certain ones. And part of the adaptive planning process is that some of those other values are going to change over time. So it's about not making decisions now that are fixed into the future, but can be changed as decision-making needs change in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Tim, let me turn to you for a moment. Could you tell us, you ended your presentation by showing us a little bit about the potential impact of the Four Seasons Hotel that was being built. And obviously you mentioned that you're in the very early stages of this, but in your work with evaluating, the impact on coral reefs of development, what are some of the things you expect to find? What are some initial findings? What are your next steps in that kind of a project?
Well, what we found, to be honest, we just started. So what we expect to find definitely will have an impact on the coral reef because it's so close. So what we're monitoring is the biodiversity of fish, if it's changed, and then what we can learn there, which fish are more impacted than others, which species, for example, but most importantly also the coverage of the coral, because for coral reef and coral reef fish, the coral is the most important part because it creates a house for this fish. And we know that because of other study that the coverage of the coral will decrease. And this is called a secondary impact. But the point is, if you add that to the concept of climate change, for example, with this heat wave, so you amplify all the effect. It's like a domino effect, right? So you weakness the ecosystem by input, the runoff and the sewage, for example, in the reef. On top of that, and then you stress the reef. Plus, the stress of climate change. I think that's the pace of the coral reef will deteriorate, or it will be faster. So that's what we expected. But also we monitoring the resilience, so to see if maybe I'm wrong, maybe they built this gigantic hotel and nothing happened to the reef. So we, this is a study that's no one done it yet, especially in real time. It's the first time that someone, monitoring this in real time. So we really expect any outcome, basically.
Thanks for that, Tim. We appreciate it. We look forward to the results. Colton, I'm going to turn back to you for a moment. There's a question here about what lessons should Japanese utilities take away from Hawaiian Electric's experience with distributed energy resources?
Gosh, thank you, Jeff. I know the person asking the question. Great question. And I know we do have folks from at least one Japanese utility in the audience. So thank you for asking it. I think one lesson to share, especially given today's topic, is that for those that perhaps are earlier in their cycle and process to integrate distributed energy resources, look for ways from sort of day one, from the very beginning, to incorporate resilience benefits into these resources. And I actually think this is something that the Japan utilities and businesses actually do a pretty decent job on. And maybe it was just how society and culturally Japan responded to and learned from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. But they look at DRs not just as a renewable energy resource or a customer choice option, but they see it as an important way to improve the resilience of electric service. So, I think looking back, I think that would be my one recommendation. But I do think the Japanese utilities do a pretty good job with it, and that we can learn from them.
Thank you, Colton. There's the ability in the Q&A to upvote questions, and the one that has received the most votes to be asked at the moment is, I think, best directed to Derek and Ian. And it is, how are you monitoring or modeling groundwater levels? Groundwater inundation is also a significant concern in Hawaii, the questioner asks.
So the model involved some investigation work by a different set of consultants on the multi-hazards. There's been a number of consultants working on their individual areas. So they took the existing bore information and the various scenarios of sea level rise and the connectedness between the sea level and the groundwater, and have produced surfaces of groundwater depth in the future with climate change scenarios. Then we've looked at also at the interaction of the fluvial. The modelling is looking at the interaction of the fluvial and the groundwater. So what influence is the groundwater having on the fluvial flooding from rainfall? So all of those have been brought together, and then in the modelling, when you input our combined probability, if you like, of the coastal event with the pluvial and fluvial event, then the groundwater forms a surface to that as to how that rises in the short term. So does that cause a short-term problem? And then over the long term, with sea level rise, when will groundwater become an issue that might require, say, permanent pumping? And obviously that changes then how you might adapt. If it is just an event that you need to deal with groundwater, then the pumping becomes potentially economical. If it becomes an issue, and parts of Christchurch are potentially like this, that groundwater may become the long-term issue, then that changes your potential adaptation approach, and that's dealt with in our board game as to those parts of sea level rise and when might pumping, what the cost and how much you might have. So adding it into the adaptation is a very clear part. It's sort of groundwater's been the elephant in the room around sea level rise. We've been probably fixated with inundation and erosion, but very clearly understand that groundwater will be, for low-lying areas, a major issue for us.
Thank you very much, Derek. We're just about out of time, so I'm just going to rapid fire give everyone on the panel a chance to make a final comment or two. And that can be about anything we discussed, but let me focus in on one potential question you could answer. There is a question here asking, what can individuals do to make a difference, to have an impact? So let me turn to you, Tim, first. You could either respond to that or if you have another final point you'd like to make. You have to unmute, sorry.
What individual can do? Well, we can start to, I think communication, outreach is very important to let people know, how we can decrease the carbon emission, for example. This, I think, monitoring also, I think it's very important, and here always we do it a lot with citizen scientists monitoring the environment and report back to us, where we can integrate this information into our modeling, for example, too, or our conclusion. I think that is the first step. That's what I think.
Thank you, Tim. Derek.
Yeah, so I think the key thing individuals could do is engage in the process with their decision makers, whether it be their councils or whatever, and so that they are engaged and the councils then understand what it is they want. Because in a lot of cases, we make assumptions about what level of tolerance, what level of risk they might accept, what sort of future do they want, and the more they engage, the more we're going to get that right.
Thank you for that, Derek. Ian, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm comfortable with that. We just talked to that point as being our one there.
Excellent. Thank you. So Colton, I'll let you have the last word before I turn it over to Veronica.
Great. And thank you everyone for this great discussion. I think Derek said it really well. There's a lot of benefits and opportunities that happens with engagement. The one thing I would add to that is education. I do think that for this audience here today, we're here because we understand and we recognize the threat and understand that there is a need, an urgent need to do something about climate change. But I don't think that's generally well understood by our broader communities that we all live and work in. And so having a foundation of education where people can begin to understand the long-term threats, right? As humans, we have a hard time assigning the right risk to long-term things. Educating ourselves really will help us be all on the same page when we do the engagement that Derek suggests. So that's my one addition.
Well said. Thank you. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Veronica, for final comments and remarks.
Thank you, David, for an excellent moderated Q&A discussion. I also want to take this time to thank all of our panelists. Colton Chang from Hawaiian Electric talked to us today about grid infrastructure planning in light of climate change. And then we also heard from Derek Todd and Ian Weissman from Jacobs about multi-hazard mitigation planning in Christchurch, and lastly from Tim Bravasi about fish adaptation in the natural environment. And it was very encouraging to see these, what do you call it, transgenerational fish capable of adapting to temporal changes, temperature changes and climate change. So thank you all for participating in today's discussion. I would like to also echo Colton's comments about the importance of education, and really that is why we are doing these webinars. Our hope is not only will audience take the information and panelists be able to collaborate with one another, but also share the information more broadly. So with that, I would like to wrap up. I would like to say that we will be having this webinar recording as well as the presentations be made available to everybody that registered. We will be sending everybody that registered an email with that information, how you will be able to access the recording as well as the slides. Naoki, if you can please put into the chat the survey. I will ask everybody who attended today's presentation, if you can please provide us your feedback. It helps us to improve our webinars and also provide you content that you are interested in. We are planning to do more of these webinars, so please stay tuned. We will be communicating via email as well as social media and our other networks to bring you information on future webinars. With that, thank you all so much for participating in today's webinar discussion, to all of our panelists, to PICHTR, as well as the OIST Foundation for their collaboration. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.